Well, let's go ahead and get started. It's 10:40. My name is Jonathan Marshall. I'm the director of the Center for Consumer Law and Education here at WVU. I'm also a practicing lawyer. The topic of today's panel discussion is related to home rule, specifically in the context of consumer protection. And so people always ask me, well, what is consumer protection? I take an expansive view of consumer protection. Consumer protection is about as wide as the ocean and about as deep. And it ranges from typical things that you would think in terms of consumer protection, debt collection, privacy issues, landlord-tenant relationships. It deals with products, it deals with services, and it deals with a whole host of other things. And so the concept here is to talk about what cities can do, are doing, ought to do when it comes to protecting consumers in those cities, and the tensions that arise. And there are a lot of tensions. In the banking world, for instance, we have preemption, right? Federal, state preemption as it pertains to interest rate caps and things of that nature. But I think privacy also is kind of an interesting, though, case study as it pertains to consumer protection, especially in this context of what cities are doing or ought not to possibly be doing. But with respect to privacy right now, there's two fundamental questions that are being addressed by regulators in all sorts of ilk, whether it's Congress or state legislators or even cities, and that is what happens or how ought data be stored and used, and what type of disclosures need to come with that, and then what should happen if that information is stolen or taken. You've got like 8 different bills pending in Congress right now trying to address that question. You've seen what California did with passing its own Data Privacy Act. Cities are passing their own Data Security Acts, and the City of Chicago just passed an ordinance dealing with it. And it's kind of an interesting discussion because essentially you have all these different regulatory regimes that are popping up, right? So that causes some inefficiency, but you've also got a situation in which you've got to address this situation, right? I mean, who knows more about you? Right? What knows more about you than anything else? It's your phone. Your phone knows so much about you. It knows more about you than your spouse, your best friend. My phone, for instance, knows when I wake up in the morning because I've got a watch that I wear, and it tracks how I'm sleeping. It knows when I go for a run. It knows who I talk to. It knows that I'm associating and talking to all the folks in this room. And in fact, I'm sure that on my Facebook feed, I'll get, who should you be friends with? Well, probably some people in this room. And so all that information is being shared, and it's going out to a lot of different people. And so again, this privacy context, though, the answers are difficult. And what you're seeing, though, is Congress has an agenda that's like 10 years old, right? And sometimes state legislatures are not any better. So they're regulating with pen and paper bits and bytes and 24/7 access, and they can't keep up. So perhaps cities, maybe there's a role for them. But these are the types of tensions that exist in this space. And so the general format is we're going to try to answer 3 questions. The is, meaning what's happening now, right? The want, what do we want to do? And then finally the question of should, what should we do? And the idea is to open up the discussion and talk about some concrete steps or some concrete roles that we could see cities playing in this very important arena. To help me do that, I've got a panel of 5 really wonderful people. I told them that I don't like introductions. I don't like being personally introduced, and I don't like to introduce other people. Their information is available online, but just very briefly. And I've also asked them I have a special request too. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly, but then they have the obligation, and I'll start by telling you something about themselves that's interesting. It doesn't have to have anything to do with this particular discussion or not. But so immediately to my right is Jennifer Wagner. Jennifer Wagner is a co-director of Mountain State Justice. Next to her is Kathy Lawson. Kathy is General Counsel for the West Virginia Division of Financial Institutions. Next to her is Mark. Mark is counsel at Jackson Kelly and was a former CEO and owner of a bank. What was the name of the bank?
Northern Hancock Bank and Trust.
Okay. Ryan Symington is a lawyer at K. Castor and Cheney. Is also the city attorney in Morgantown. And then Loren Allen, who's with the West Virginia Bankers Association, and is also was formerly with the Division of Financial Institutions. And so, one interesting thing about me, it's not covered in my bio, I have crashed no fewer than 2 movie sets. The last movie set that I crashed was in New Orleans. The name of the movie is Night Teeth. It's a thriller, Night Teeth. It's due to be released Netflix next year, I believe. And there's a bar scene, and I should be in it, maybe. Jennifer?
So I had about 2 minutes warning of coming up with something interesting about myself. I'm not sure I can do it, but I will say that and this is a little bit relevant to this discussion, my first real job after college was working full-time for the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. So I was a former city employee before becoming a lawyer and a consumer advocate.
Wow, I don't know how I can follow those. Jonathan, you set the bar high.
Yeah.
I gave you 10 minutes to figure it out.
You did. And it's totally irrelevant. One interesting thing about me, I have a private pilot license with instrument privileges.
Oh,
It's
I
just
like that.
a lot of fun
Good.
and makes life interesting and drives my parents crazy.
I'm Mark Mangano, and we'll talk later because I do too. But no, the most interesting thing is that while I practice here in Morgantown, my hometown is Chester, West Virginia, and it is home of the world's largest teapot. And if you need an afternoon activity, you should come to Chester and have your picture taken with it.
This is so good, and I'm so happy to be going towards the end. To follow up on these. I'm right beside 2 pilots, and I like to spend most of my free, non-work, non-family time moving around just on 2 feet. So I guess my interesting thing is I've run a Boston Marathon qualifying time. I'm unfortunately not participating this April, but someday I'll be there.
So I have 2 sons, Jackson and Bodie. And years ago, Jackson decided he wanted to get into theater. And so I took him and walked in that day and said, hey, he was auditioning. And I said, hey, what can I do to help? Since that time, I have designed, I think, somewhere around 15 sets for children's theater productions in my spare time. So.
All right, I appreciate that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then. I told you that the first thing that we're going to cover was the landscape. So what I'd like to hear from our panelists first about is what does the landscape look like? What are cities doing in West Virginia? What's happening nationally with respect to regulation of consumer protection issues by cities? And I think what we'll do is, and I'll skip the order back and forth. We're going to start with Jennifer first, and we'll go down the line.
Sure. So to my knowledge, I don't think that any cities are particularly in West Virginia operating a lot, and people feel free to correct me, in the home rule space and consumer protection. I know across the country, especially large cities, are occupying that space in a variety of different ways. Some things that are particularly, we were talking before the panel, and I think there's sort of 3 categories of areas where cities can operate in this space. One is obviously regulatory, where you're talking about ordinances, licensing requirements, zoning, things like that. Another area is enforcement, and then another area is sort of education, tax relief, issues like that that are sort of, I guess, more ephemeral than the regulatory enforcement areas. I mean, I think to me, one area that's particularly interesting in the regulatory area to think about is cities do have a lot of authority both over their own utility structures and in terms of, and there's a lot of room for consumer protection in terms of local utilities, water boards. There's there's a whole complex regulatory scheme around utility regulation, but because a lot of those are operated by the local cities, there's some interesting areas for protecting consumers against unlawful shutoffs, and giving proper notices, rate relief issues for low-income consumers, and so forth. In terms of enforcement, there are a lot of cities that have done really interesting work if you have the resources to engage in enforcement. I know the city of Cincinnati went after some banks after the foreclosure crisis for letting buildings, foreclosed properties go into decline. There's a lot of, there were some ordinances passed to try to address the same issues, and those were in some areas seem to be preempted. But in terms of enforcement, the city has standing to sue Bank of America for foreclosing on a bunch of properties and then not paying property taxes, allowing the properties to fall down, creating a nuisance. There have been really interesting enforcement actions on fair lending, also in the wake of the foreclosure crisis, where I know Memphis and Shelby County, Baltimore, some other areas sued banks, especially Wells Fargo comes to mind, for discriminatory lending practices that then led to foreclosures in predominantly African American communities, which impacted the tax base and gave the city standing to sue. And then I know that recently Atlanta and maybe Cincinnati have gone after some rent-to-own scams or companies that in a sort of class action, well, there have been class actions, and then also the cities have sued because these rent-to-own companies that are large corporations are essentially trying to shift the burden of maintaining property onto low-income people who are also renters, and then foreclosing on them, kicking them out, and bringing in another low-income person. So there are a lot of areas for enforcement actions that I think are really interesting.
So I'm actually look at things from, I guess, the flip side of a lot of what Jennifer looks at. I work in the financial institution regulatory world. So on a daily basis, we deal with and work within a structure where you have an interplay with state and federal law, certainly all of the time. So it would seem to me that certainly one of the challenges that a municipality or a county would face when trying to enact an ordinance in this environment would be, what laws are already out there. Jonathan mentioned specifically preemption. So preemption of state law is vast by the federal government and certainly in the banking arena. So I would really want to look at what kind of interest in particular, especially in the world of financial institutions, is the municipality or local government looking to protect, and is there some kind of gap in the legislation? We're very fortunate, from our perspective, that we have great working relationships with all of the other regulators who work in this space. So we've developed a really a peaceful coexistence. So everyone really respects the long-standing boundaries that have been established. So I think there's probably room to do more. It's just a matter of figuring out how all the parts will work together.
I think Jennifer did a very good job of laying out basically the three options that municipalities have to kind of enter the space. And again, we're talking more broadly than just financial services, which is pretty well tied down, and there isn't a lot of room for maneuvering for municipalities in that area. But it's still challenging because it's an uphill battle to start to bring litigation, and we've seen primarily larger cities with larger budgets, and there's a critical mass of people to represent getting into that. And also, I think we've seen situations where perhaps there was well-intentioned ordinances enacted, and they didn't expect the backlash. So I think that part of the challenge in doing legislation at the municipal level is maybe lack of resources and lack of perspectives that are on hand to inform the decisions about what's really appropriate. And I think we saw that kind of in the soda, taxing soda in New York. There was the idea was that we were going to fight obesity with that, and it seemed very well intentioned and kind of a neat idea on its surface, but there was a lot of backlash among the people that they were protecting, and certainly at the state level, which led to state legislation to preempt that and take them out of action. In other cities, they attacked it a different way and looked at taxing things like soda and using that specifically for some other social benefit. And that kind of led to the state legislator saying, no, that seems like a decent idea. They didn't go through the front door, they went through the back door. So I think one of the key issues is where municipalities think they have some space, that they really need to think about the political fallout and the political landscape beyond the municipality when they go ahead and implement these things, and have an argument ready for those who may oppose them that is broader than just the solution they chose.
Ryan?
I think that's Mark makes some good points about the limitations on municipal action in the state, and particularly with respect to instituting litigation can be a resource issue for municipalities the size we have, and regulating can be difficult with the enabling legislation given to municipalities. But one of the and so because of those things, you don't see a lot of overt regulation in this space by municipalities, at least at this point. And I'm not very familiar with other municipalities pursuing that authority through home rule yet. But one of the avenues mentioned in the article you shared was empowering consumers through, in part, being a collection point and one with credibility for consumers. And I know cities do that because they are close to consumers, and they have code enforcement departments who enforce the state building code, fire marshals who enforce the fire laws, and so interact with people who may have consumer issues and are able to at least provide information. So our code enforcement department provides some semi-regular seminars on what the building code requires and how compliance can be met. They also maintain records which are public, which show when violations have been found. And I think sometimes to them it's frustrating that they can't revoke a contractor's license, but municipal licensing authority is coextensive with the state, and that's not an option municipalities have. But they can act as that information point, that collection point, and both refer those issues they become aware of to state agencies with the authority to address them, and also inform the local constituents with whom they interact when those issues are common.
Loren?
So I think I would just reiterate, to Mark's point, financial services in general is a super heavily regulated industry, and it has been for a very long time. And there's a very complex regulatory structure, both from the federal regulators and the state regulators, as Kathy pointed out. And so I think it would be very difficult, right, for a municipality to sort of step in, wade into that space, given the existing statutory framework and regulatory framework. And to that extent, as far as just regulatory and passing specific consumer protection type ordinances, one of the things that we've been sort of watching and listening to some conversations about, and this is very specific here in West Virginia, but and you sort of touched on this, is land use and some of the municipalities, small cities that are dealing with dilapidated and abandoned structures. And I think that there's an interesting intersection there in that particular space for a conversation about consumer protection and how municipal governments act and oversee that type of property within their within their municipal boundaries, and the impact that has on consumers who could be property owners, right? But also consumers who live and work and consume in those communities. And the financial institutions that that are involved on all elements of that, whether it's the actual dilapidated property or adjacent surrounding properties. I think that there's a lot of space there for a conversation in that regard for consumer protection. So that's something that we've been sort of watching.
Can I just pipe in one thing? In terms of like actual like consumer financial like ordinances and stuff, there are at least some large cities that are on home rule have enacted some that aren't subject to preemption, and what you can't have like an interest rate cap or something like that. But New York City has a Unfair and Deceptive Acts and Practices Act specific to New York City, and there would be some questions potentially about state preemption and how a local ordinance would interact with our state consumer protection law. But my assumption would be that if it is broad and more protective than the state law, and of general applicability, then the a local ordinance could be protective. Then there'd still be a question of the enforcement of that local ordinance. But I don't, I think we will talk a fair amount about preemption, and that in this space that is a major issue. But I think there are areas that are beyond that. And like I said, New York City has its own consumer protection law.
Great. To kind of add to that, in terms of kind of the landscape, I created a little bit of a list. Landlord-tenant issues, right? Right now in West Virginia, there is a case out there that basically holds that the Consumer Credit Protection Act does not apply to landlord-tenant type relationships. It's caused some issues. And there's actually a new law review article out there that addresses some of those issues, and perhaps somebody who's in this room may want to address that a little bit later. Another area is utility purchasing. Cities in Massachusetts, for instance, are buying up utility type credits and then trying to offer more affordable power and other types of services. Broadband access. Municipalities are getting in the business of offering broadband because they recognize that that's a pretty important service for the city itself and for business owners as well as residents. And so cities are getting in that space. Privacy, I talked about. Health and welfare issues, which I think we talked about. That includes blighted buildings as a result of foreclosure, harmful products, sugary drinks, if you want to consider those harmful products. Discrimination, which I think there was another panel on. And discrimination is a form of consumer protection in the sense that you have certain statutes that prohibit discriminatory decisions as it pertains to making credit decisions. Access to housing is another area. Also, direct litigation. So in West Virginia, what's happening right now? Cities are filing lawsuits against opioid manufacturers and distributors. And so that is also, I believe, a form of consumer protection. So these are kind of some of the landscape, if you will. And one of the other things that Ryan had mentioned was I had circulated an article to this group by Suzanne Block-Lieb, and it dealt with cities as a source of consumer financial empowerment. And her position was that what cities can do is maybe they can't overtly regulate in some areas, but they can be a source of empowerment, meaning they can be information collectors. So for instance, having a database that stores all the complaints about scams that are happening, bad business practices, and make that available to people in the city. They can also be a dissemination provider, meaning hosting essentially talks and workshops so people can maybe better protect themselves as to the particular problems that the city's facing as it pertains to consumer protection. So there's that concept too. And there's debate about that, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We can talk about that when we get to want and should. But before we do that, I do want to kind of continue with our discussion about the landscape and talk a little bit about what are some of the challenges that cities face in this space, and also to address the why question. Why ought they do things in this space? And so to do that, to lead off, I think I'm going to start with Mark.
Uh-oh. Are we on why or what?
You can do why and challenges.
Yeah, I think
We're not on want yet. We haven't got to
Okay.
want yet, but I'm just saying, why are cities doing it now? And what are some of the challenges that they face?
Well, I think, again, you have municipalities tend to take action first because they're closer very often to the issue. They can see how it's directly impacting their neighborhoods, their economic development of their communities, and so it's immediate. And so I think there's a drive very often to try to find an immediate solution, and so you scramble to find practical solutions. And that's where I think the challenge comes in, is because it's a minefield. The landscape is there's lots of opportunities for preemption. There is also the political landscape that if it isn't preempted now, basically the home rule is authorized to do pretty much anything that isn't against the Constitution or the general law of West Virginia as it stands now or will be. So you have to always have that on your horizon, that whatever we decide to do may get challenged. And so that's and again, you have limited resources, especially smaller municipalities. How much can you afford to be out there fighting with somebody about whether this rule should stand or not? And so it takes the analysis to a second level. It's what do we want to do? Do we think we have a good solution? But how do we protect this and do it in a way that is not going to break the bank?
Who else wants to address this? This is the why and challenges question. Loren?
I think, one of the things that we talk about a lot in the banking industry is the survival of the community bank model and access. I think Jennifer mentioned this at the beginning of her remarks, is just access to financial services, right? We see more and more banks, small local community banks, just closing up shop, getting purchased and moving out. And I know, there are a number of communities when I was at the Division of Financial Institutions, and even since then, that small towns lose their bank. And you no longer have access to, it's a 25-mile drive to your ATM to get cash on your card, or and so I think that is also a consumer protection issue, right? Is people in the community having access to financial services, and that's, I think, should be part of the equation, right? When municipalities are thinking about educating and protecting consumers and understanding the needs of the community and the people that they serve, I think that's an important factor.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the why, I think a lot of the reason that home rule has a lot of cachet right now is because people who want to actually push the agenda try to increase consumer protections or protections for people broadly, and see that maybe not happening as much on the federal level, and then sometimes not on the state level, want to see if there are ways to push the envelope on the more local level. So I think that there are some, in addition to the reasons that were previously discussed about the proximity and knowledge base in the local level, this sort of maybe different political climates in different municipalities that might have different interests and want to promote different interests on behalf of their citizens. I do think there's some, in terms of tensions, you obviously have the preemption tension, but then there's also, and I think this was discussed a little bit by Mark too, like the potential backlash that if you are trying to, if you're in a municipality that is maybe more progressive than the state, you might end up generating state legislation that is worse than already exists in order to preempt your local legislation. And so I think there's a real tension there about how to do it and what you want to be doing and how you justify it as appropriate for your local municipality, whereas and not appropriate to be bringing up to a statewide agenda. I mean, I think some other issues that have come up in my thinking about this have been, West Virginia, as opposed to some of these other localities that have done really aggressive work. Our geographic boundaries of our cities, of our municipalities, are rather small, and so take Morgantown for example. If you have put forth a local ordinance that maybe require special licensing requirements for used car dealers and bonding, and is more onerous to make sure to protect consumers from fraudulent, misleading practices with used car dealers. All they have to do is move up to the mile ground where they already are. So they don't, to escape the local boundaries and get out of those requirements. And so by doing that, and I'd be curious about Ryan's thoughts about this, but you end up losing some of your tax base. And so there's a little bit of a conflict there. You might be trying to protect your citizens, but by doing that, all you're doing is locating businesses just outside the city boundary. So I think those are some really interesting questions in terms of whether or not to do this.
Ryan.
Yeah, I think Jen puts makes a very compelling point about the challenges for municipalities in regulating this conduct and other conducts in that, because we're a rural state. You don't have the same kind of capacity just through density or through size to govern a real territory. But then that problem perpetuates itself as well, right? Because if you do something that is important to your citizens, but that impacts an industry in such a way that it's inclined to move outside of the boundaries of the city, that impacts the tax base and that impacts the resources the city has to then do other regulation that is important to the citizens. And of course that ties into the first part of that question, why, and the reason is access. People can go to their city council member and go to their city council meetings easily and raise those concerns. And while other levels of government may have more capacity and more funding to address them, they're not nearly as accessible.
Kathy, you want to add?
Sure, I'll just add on to what was just said about accessibility of local governments for the citizens. So, assuming that local government can get through all of these, hurdles that everyone has already addressed, they probably can also act a little more quickly to address a perceived wrong or a gap in maybe some consumer protection that they've maybe heard their local citizens do want. So by having this smaller governmental entity to deal with, maybe they can move more quickly than we could at the state level, and certainly much more quickly than anyone could at the federal level.
Good. Thank you. So with that said, so you can see, so in terms of the landscape, there's lots of different areas in which cities are now getting involved in consumer protection regulation. And the reason for that, there's lots of different reasons, but I think what you're hearing is a primary reason, of course, is access and flexibility and the ability to do things more quickly and address more current problems. But the drawback is that just what I think Jennifer was talking about, what Ron was talking about, is geographical location, right? So yeah, so you have a great idea. Let's go ahead and maybe have a little more stricter licensing or some bonding requirements on certain types of industries. We'll go to those industries and move out of your city. Okay, well now you lost a very valuable piece of your tax bracket. So now people get mad about that. And so there are challenges there. There's challenges to resources. You were talking about the UDAP statutes, right? So unfair, deceptive acts or practices. These are pretty common in all states, and it prohibits virtually all sorts of things, but basically lying and cheating and stealing when you're selling goods or services, right? How are you going to enforce that at the municipal level? Now, you have this model with the opioid litigation where cities are actually hiring private lawyers to enforce certain provisions, and so that's also a different or interesting model that's out there. But what I'd like to do now is, in terms of the landscape, is there anybody who has a question or a comment? This is a relatively small group, so I'm going to call the audience. Anybody wants to address anything or have any questions about kind of what's happening now? Sir, in the back, I'll bring you the mic. Well, they have to get you on. They have to get you on the internet, or it didn't happen. So
there's a rumor out there that banks have a duty to consumers to make small loans, to make community development sort of issues, things that would help little people. And it's been a rumor because I've never seen it enforced. I've never seen any kind of monograph or some sort of study as to what those duties are. And since we have bankers on the panel, could you address the requirements of banks to make small loans, to do community development things? And finally, would you think that a city would have standing to file some sort of suit to enforce that?
Mark, do you want to address this one?
I lived in this space for 26 years. So, there are a couple of things. One is you have the Community Reinvestment Act, and that is not so much about small dollar lending. That is more about trying to hold financial institutions accountable for reinvesting the deposit base back in the community where they got it, not just porting, basically taking all the deposits and putting them in some other community. And so that's a fairly complex structure, and there is talk of revisiting that because the landscape is completely different now. Some banks don't even have a physical location anymore, and so that's much more complicated. The concept of small dollar lending has been a big challenge for the regulators as well as the industry. The problem is that because lending has become so commoditized, we have a lot of very efficient systems for a lot of customers, but the people who need small dollar loans tend to be, for a variety of reasons, self-selected higher risk customers, and they are not, strangely, all that profitable. Even at high rates, the administrative costs of a very small loan are gobbled up by the administrative cost of just taking a payment every month and processing those things through and maybe taking collateral. So that's a very challenging area because it's not very profitable to encourage banks to do it. And there are some who do it well, but it's been an operational challenge as much as anything. It's not so much, I think, that banks don't want to do it. They struggle to find a way to do it that doesn't overly eat up the bottom line. And frankly, it was a focus of my bank, so it's a place near and dear to my heart. But even for us, we kind of had to start to put some lower limits on it just because we couldn't afford to go that low. And that lower limits were $1,500, $2,000, and so things that were smaller than that were a real challenge even for a small community bank. Did that help at all? No? Okay.
Who else wants to address the question? Come on, Kathy. Oh, got another. You want to address the question, or you want to offer another comment? Yep, still asking them.
I'll just say that was an excellent answer by an excellent banker. The banks are making those loans. They are doing that business. But I think, like Mark said, when you evaluate that kind of activity across your entire line of business, I think it is a very difficult thing. And one of the things that we hear time and time again from our bank members across the state are, there's this perception that the banks aren't doing the business, but when you talk to the banks, there's the demand is not there. I mean, and especially in some of the small communities, the demand just isn't there. And they would love to be able to make those loans and love to have those opportunities to invest in the community, and it's just not present. And so I think the real solution is probably a much larger solution about more macroeconomic sort of factors in those communities. But it is happening. And it's, sorry, somebody say something?
No, that was me.
Okay.
I was just going to say really quickly, if anyone's interested in the Community Reinvestment Act, there's some proposed rules on the CRA that are, from my perspective, incredibly harmful and really undermine and not just mine, the perspective of pretty much every consumer advocate in the entire country and housing advocate that are really, really harmful and undermining the purposes of the CRA. So to the extent anyone's interested in community reinvestment of banking and making sure that that happens effectively and meaningfully, and that the CRA is appropriately implemented, I would really urge you to Google it, look at some of the comments, and submit a comment as they're considering the rules. So that's just a slight plug on that. I would also just, in terms of small dollar lending, I think that there are some, in West Virginia, thankfully, because of some usury caps that are on the state level, we don't have the really predatory and horrific small dollar lending that happens in a lot of other states, that payday loans, stuff like that. But I do think that the city financials as sort of non-bank institutions aggressively market and end up a lot in that space, whereas the banks that would probably be giving more favorable or appropriate rates to consumers. I mean, part of the problem is this bank consolidation and the fact that those are leaving the local communities. So I know in some other states there are like credit unions and nonprofit banking institutions that have opened up particularly to provide a more affordable model on the local level. And I think just sort of going back a little bit to the topic, you know, there are some ways for municipalities to maybe consider trying to encourage local banking, encourage these credit unions and other models that might provide a better investment in the community than some of these other national non-bank lenders.
Other questions or comments about the landscape? Ma'am? You should introduce yourself too.
Hi, I'm Jenny Brobst. I'm from Southern Illinois University. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to comment a little bit on local taxation and home rule. Because Illinois, for example, municipalities can opt in, and sometimes they don't, because they don't trust their local authorities' use of the coffers. And you might get added layers of taxation that, particularly in a state that has a state budget crisis. And I've noticed some states around the country that also are suffering financially. Sometimes they eye greedily home rule as a way to generate revenue, but the voters themselves are not necessarily trusting of the leadership to handle it well. And what's interesting as well is that when you look at turnover in city councils and the rest, it's sometimes you get the same people in there for a very, very long time. And it's not like particularly smaller communities. And so do you have any thoughts about how to use home rule strategically in such a way that it's used responsibly and there's accountability of the coffers?
That's an easy question. No. Let's tackle that one. Ryan.
That's a great question, and it's a big focus of what the home rule program has involved in West Virginia. Our home rule legislation in its current form specifically allows a 1% sales tax that's administered by the state, and almost unanimously the participating municipalities have enacted those taxes, and I think with community support. Our state's overall tax regime for cities is somewhat unique. We use a business and occupation tax that was devolved from the state onto the cities, and it's one of only 3 states, I believe, that still uses that form. And then municipalities get a small capped increment on the property tax. So a sales tax is a more common and many people think more equitable way to generate revenue for the municipalities. But it is it's circumscribed by the home rule legislation itself, so that cities only have the authority to ask for up to that 1% additional sales tax. There was, in the initial pilot phase of the program, which will be part of the panel this afternoon, there's a proposal by Huntington to enact also an occupation tax that was challenged and never implemented. But it seems that that is both an additional funding mechanism and one that is supported locally by people who are trusting their governments to use that well. Morgantown has just enacted, as a latecomer to this this initiative, but just enacted last year its sales tax, which will go into effect in July, and that accountability is important to people. And so one way that Morgantown and a lot of other communities are dealing with that is to dedicate that revenue to a special revenue fund so that even if it is flowed through to the general fund, ultimately there is specific accounting for the sales tax revenue and the projects for which it is used.
So I want to move on, and I want to talk about want. So when we're talking about want, the concept here is if left untethered, meaning from practical considerations, from considerations of preemption and all these legal niceties and things that aren't so nice, what do we want? What would we want cities to do? Because I think it's an important intellectual exercise. Because the idea is we live obviously within constraints, and we're going to talk about the should in a little bit, which kind of takes into consideration both the practical realities, but I think it's important to understand what is the want here. So this is a hard question, perhaps, but I'd like to have the panelists each address, I'll give you 2 minutes to address the want question. And now, don't look at me like that. I gave you guys some of these questions beforehand, so let's go ahead and address the want for a minute. So we'll start with who? We'll start with Loren. Want. Or not want, for that matter, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the industry perspective, and I mentioned earlier, just the importance of preserving the community bank model would be important. There's a place in every market for institutions of all different sizes, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. But the community bank model is particularly important in a state like West Virginia that's very rural and has very small communities. And I think access to local decision making in financial services is important. And as a part of that, I think some of the things that you mentioned, broadband access, right? Development and land use, all those things come into play, and I think those are all important sort of building blocks to getting a municipality to a place where they're doing the best they can do for their for consumers within their boundaries. Other than that, I think we want municipalities to probably stay out of the direct regulatory arena. And as I said at the beginning of this, I mean, the banking industry is very heavily regulated. It's a very complex regulatory regime, and there are lots of overlapping regulatory structures. And I think to have municipalities that lack the expertise and the resources and things like that to enter into that regime really, really would complicate things. That's not to say that the municipalities don't have a place, like I said, in protecting those consumers and for access. But I think that's the big thing, is just protecting the community model and making sure that consumers have access. And the local decision making thing I think is important, because I see all the time when we talk even about regulatory issues, or where the bank may have done something wrong or made a mistake, a lot of times just having the relationship in the communities and knowing the people that are involved and the relationship between the banks and their customers is such an important critical factor in resolving conflicts, resolving disputes, and making sure that people's consumers' needs are being met. And I think when you see those types of institutions disappearing, and those services and decision making being taken out of the communities, I think it becomes much more difficult and much more complicated.
Good. So. All right, Ryan, you've got the magic wand now. What do you want or not want?
That is a legitimately difficult question. I think our communities clearly are not monolithic, right? And there are certainly people I encounter a lot in my practice, people wanting more activity by the municipality. There are people who would like a local regulatory scheme and local regulators and enforcement actions to help them. And local government is a community service, and I think people who people come in and just expect that of their government and are sometimes disappointed if they hear, which they do. We're concerned about this, and we're going to refer this to the Attorney General's office or report this to the contractor licensing board. So I think there's a lot of desire for that, and I recognize that there are other aspects of the community that desire more uniform regulation, more maybe stability among different communities where they necessarily operate at scale. So, balancing those. Yeah, well, I represent municipalities and think they're great operators in this space, and I think they do a responsible and good job of acting. And so I think at least the capacity to act is important, and I think that has been something that the home rule program has shown.
Okay, Mark?
Well, it would seem that the area that there's opportunity and understanding is really in public health and safety areas. That's probably a place there's probably less preemption and more localized concerns that you can identify and really do something about. I think I do want to make a plug for preemption because one of the things that we tend to forget.
I think
Especially in the financial
banks
services
will.
area,
Yeah.
So I'm like, but what's the social utility of that? Again, we're taking this from the viewpoint of how do we enable home rule, but what's the benefit to our communities of industries that are subject to regulatory schemes that are predictable and, again, across scale? Even though my little community bank only operated in two towns, I operated under a regulatory environment that was predictable, stable, Dodd-Frank. But in any event, it was pretty stable, and so you knew what the rules were, and so you could go out there, create models that you could repeat. You weren't one-offing your decisions every day, and so you could create models that were more efficient, so you could reach more customers at a lower cost. And we sort of take that a bit for granted today. And again, there are parts of our society that are not being adequately reached with financial services. But for the vast majority of the population, access to credit is better and cheaper than it has ever been in the history of the universe. And a lot of that is because of really solid regulatory scheme, and thank you very much to the State Division of Financial Institutions. And that's why we still do have a fairly robust, even though it is a concern that we're losing community banks, we still have a very robust community banking sector because we've had good, stable, predictable regulation. So, and that's the plug for why we should be very careful before we jump in and try to second guess a regulatory scheme, even if we can see a wrong that needs to be righted. There may be some countervailing benefits that we're not taking into account.
All right. Kathy, want or not want?
It depends.
Your answer.
I think that, Jennifer and Mark have both, I think, presented, a lot of great ideas for areas that are probably suitable for municipalities and local governments to jump into this arena, particularly if it's an issue that's not addressed elsewhere or that is not really firmly entrenched, established, stable, like financial services industry. But, I go back to that point, identify an interest, that the local government is trying to protect, and is there room in that space for additional consumer protection? We've, touched on access, so there are so many positives that a municipality can bring in attempting to address a concern that they have that exists for their citizens. But I think the only negative I would maybe address is that a lot of work is done online now, not just in financial services. But you also have the challenge, and Jennifer touched on this a bit, of encouraging businesses to locate in your communities. And if you're throwing an additional layer of regulation out there, how much does that discourage an industry or a company from coming into your area?
Fair. Jennifer?
And I know, so everyone's had trouble with this blue sky approach that you're throwing out there because it doesn't really make sense in the context of, like why even talk, it doesn't, whatever. But I will say, I would say, and I think these are actually doable, at least some of them. I guess the issue that Ryan pointed out is from the resource issue. So if you set aside the political landscape and stuff like that, I still think a major problem is resources for these municipal governments to actually do any of this. And I think one way to do that is, I think the enforcement angle does take sort of upfront costs, but then it is likely, if you have good cases against financially solvent companies, that it will bring money back into your community and hopefully fund the enforcement measures going forward. If you can put some of that money back into that enforcement, hiring a lot of cities that are much larger than the ones we have here have units that particularly, what they do is the enforcement. They hire lawyers and who work on that. So I think that would be helpful, and I think one way to do that is to partner with, to bring in, even though it's expensive, to bring in outside firms if you don't have a full-time lawyer to contract with. And I know in some municipalities, there's been partnering with nonprofit organizations as well that are interested in pursuing these cases on a public interest standpoint. And we've actually, Mountain State Justice has in some circumstances represented municipal governments or their subsections in dealing with issues mostly around education, less around, and conflicts potentially between the municipalities and the state. But, I think there are areas to join resources for a common goal there. Some other specific things that I think would be really valuable is, we were talking about UDAP enforcement. If there is additional UDAP authority in a local government, it doesn't have to just be enforceable by a city attorney. You can have a private right of action. And I think to the extent that there's an interest in passing local ordinances that protect the people in that community in particular, but then there's not enough resources to actually enforce them, incorporating a private right of action so that the private bar has the ability to enforce them and act as, and fee shifting statutes so that the private bar can act as private attorneys general, but on the local level, could enable that regime to actually be successful. And those issues, those sort of procedural issues, should not be subject to preemption. Now, there are political, backlash potentially. In terms of identifying what an ordinance would address, I think that a lot of what's been discussed here is the proximity and accessibility of the city government and the ability to hear what's actually happening at the local level that's different than elsewhere. And I think it would be really interesting for cities to engage in consideration of what products and services are being provided within their city limits to the most vulnerable people. So if you target it not at, what are people complaining about, broadly speaking, but what are people who are extremely low income? What are people who are dealing with disabilities? What are people who are dealing with language access problems? People who are at a particularly challenging life stage, and I know this might be a sort of incendiary example, but there are discussions sometimes about pregnancy crisis centers which advertise services to pregnant women who are in a challenging situation, and they're run by churches or groups that are anti-abortion and provide very biased counseling services. And some municipalities and some groups have required disclosures on advertisements about crisis pregnancy centers. So, looking at what's happening in the community to people who are at a vulnerable time in their lives or otherwise vulnerable to being taken advantage of, and then what can those municipalities do to address those situations that are really local to them. So pawnbroker, and that aren't otherwise being addressed. Pawnbrokers is something Kathy had brought up before. You know, what's happening here that we need to step into the space of. Couple other really quick things. I would love to see like real financial literacy required in middle and high schools. And I don't think anyone here would disagree with that. But I'd rather, I mean, I think that there's space for that potentially on the local level or regional level, but I would love to see it required on the state level. But maybe that's an area to sort of push forward on a, you know, start on a local level and rise up, because it's not actually, I don't think that there would be a lot of conflict about it. And then also, like someone said, broadband and utility access and regulation, I think, is a really good space for municipalities to work in.
Good, thank you. All right. So I'm going to open up the want question, and in my defense, part of this, and the reason I asked the want question is, I bet you 100 years from now that the discussion we're having right now will not be resolved. This notion of devolution, local control, this is never going to go away. And so while you might have a regulatory system or certain constraints that exist today, they aren't necessarily the type of constraints that exist tomorrow. And part of the really important reason you ask the want question is, how do you create the conditions to achieve the want? Of course, you can't do it now for certain things, right? You couldn't see cities, you know, enacting interest rate rules today, but perhaps at some point in time, maybe that might be something that would be desirable. I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying. So that's why we asked the want question, I think. But I do actually have, I would like, actually, Emily, I told you that I was going to call on somebody to address the want question, perhaps. And Emily, why don't you introduce yourself and also talk just a couple minutes about your article.
Okay. Hi, I am Emily Kramer. I am a 3L here at WVU Law and on the Law Review. I recently, as in last month, published a Law Review article on landlord-tenant law in the state of West Virginia. So just a few years ago, we had the Supreme Court rule that the West Virginia Consumer Credit Protection Act did not cover landlord-tenant contracts. And so what the article goes into a lot is it's basically the tenant's fate in the mountain state. What kind of avenues are left for them for protections? What kind of laws we still have that they should rely on and be educated about? And then going towards the more municipal route, what can maybe local communities do? So West Virginia is a vast state, it's mountainous. Some regions are very residential, and then there's Morgantown, which is primarily student body when the school is in session, so it becomes a renter area. So I bring into question the idea of local municipalities looking at their communities and seeing what their residents might need for protections. And this can also go into making sure that residents will stay in the state, so especially in the young population of West Virginia is sometimes leaving. So if you can have more protections for especially a renter population who doesn't have the economic means to purchase a home or anything, you may be able to entice them to stay in the community. So that's kind of what it goes into a little bit.
Good, thank you. Okay. So we actually have 15 minutes left, I think. 15 minutes left, yes. So I'm gonna, we have a want, a desire, all right. Introduce yourself.
Casey Baker, Marshall University. One of the issues we've been looking at in this area is the emergence and adoption of financial technology, specifically blockchain and cryptocurrency, to the point now where the OCC is offering national bank charters to some of these cryptocurrency firms. What is left for local and state governments to address in terms of the issues that these cryptocurrencies sometimes bring with them? Some of the use by criminal enterprises and things like that.
Kathy.
So I can tell you a little bit about what we do currently. So, and actually, some states have a much broader regulation than we do in West Virginia. So to the extent any of these companies utilize a wallet to hold either fiat currency or cryptocurrency on behalf of someone, and it doesn't have to be a consumer, so the West Virginia law doesn't make a distinction. To the extent there is currency of some sort held in a wallet, there's state regulation as money transmitter. So there are enforcement provisions, bonding provisions, like you would see in any typical financial institution regulatory program. However, if there is not an active wallet and they just have a trading platform, for example, we don't regulate that activity at all. Some states do, however, and some states actually are expanding the reach of their regulation as that industry grows.
Good. All right. Well, I want to get to the should. So I'm going to ask another hard question. So we've talked about the landscape. We've talked about wants. What I would like to talk about now is the should, and understanding resource constraints, understanding regulatory constraints. What should we be doing now? And to kind of set the stage for this, I'm going to have each of our panelists address this question, but you can only pick one thing, a single thing. What would you see? What should cities be doing in this space? Or maybe should not, too. But one thing, only one thing. So who wants to go first? One thing. Not two, one. Ryan?
Sure, yeah, that counts as volunteering, right? I think this discussion has been great, and the panel is great, and it's enlightening for me to see these other perspectives. So I think the clear thing that emerges that cities should be doing is regulating building conditions under the building code. Those are consumer spaces in many instances, and particularly in Morgantown. Municipalities are the sole enforcers of the state building code in West Virginia. It's a clear space where they have both authority and expertise, and so that's an area where there's clear help that can be provided.
Good. Who wants to go next? Mark.
I don't so much have a thing. I have an approach.
Okay. You can do
which
an
I'll
approach.
suggest.
One approach.
Okay, but I think the approach that I will suggest plays well, whatever the topic is first really be careful about defining the perceived wrong. Narrowly focus what is it we're really trying to fix. Sometimes we try to address the symptom and not the root problem. And I think making sure that we're attacking the right thing is more likely to lead to a successful remedy. Then carefully consider the existing regulatory and political landscape, and weigh those political considerations. And I think you've done all of those things. Then when you go to craft a solution, you are more likely to be effective and cost effective at the same time in getting it accomplished. And I think you have the additional benefit of taking that steady, quiet, deliberative approach is you may be a leader for the state. Again, as Ryan kind of points out, there may be some things about health and safety and building codes and things like that may, and I think that has happened, to where those things have come out of municipal deliberations and been adopted by states as a great best practice, which would not have bubbled to the surface in the statewide political process.
That's actually good. I'm glad you actually brought up the approach, because the approach matters, right? So a single approach, that makes sense. All right, who wants to address the should next? Jennifer.
I will. I think, just going off what Mark said, because I kind of agree as to that the approach is what matters more than the topic, because the whole point of this is that the municipalities you want the municipalities to be responding to something that is local and appropriate for that municipality. So saying, something about pawnbrokers is not necessarily going to be the thing for everyone. So I would just say, just to build on the approach that Mark was proposing, which I think is right, is that you want to make sure that you have all of the stakeholders involved in the discussion about what the problems are and what the solutions are, because if and that can sometimes be resource intensive, but sometimes municipalities do also outsource that process. They can hire or collaborate with a nonprofit or a for-profit group that brings together stakeholders. Sometimes that's BS, like that it's done as a way to check a box. Obviously, that's not what we're talking about. Like, I think bringing together people in a really meaningful discussion about what exists out there, what the considerations are, so that when you have ordinances passed, that they are actually appropriate. And I'm also not just talking about lobbyists. So just to be clear about that. And then I think the other thing to build on what Mark said is, once you have an ordinance or some sort of regime that addresses a local problem, that to make sure that there are appropriate enforcement mechanisms for that. Because without that enforcement, it's a meaningless prospect. And to think about that enforcement within the context of and the confines of what the resources are of the municipality. So is it self-effectuating? Is it a licensure regime where people have to reapply? Is it something that requires litigation? And if it requires litigation, does it require litigation by the city, or can it be a private right of action by private individuals, and so on and so forth? And then the final plug I would just put in there is what I said before. I would really like to have any of these issues really addressed toward the most vulnerable people in our populations, because that's where the exploitation takes place. So, I think that lens should be on whenever you're evaluating what the real problems are, rather than, rather than just taking everything in the door.
Good. Loren.
I think I'll just reiterate again. Municipalities should be thinking about availability of services and access, not just for the unbanked and the underbanked, which are important and vulnerable populations, but for every consumer in the community, and even small dollar loans or people who are interested in entrepreneurship. I think that's a critical part of thinking about the overall health of a consumer populace is access to financial services, and so that should be a factor.
Kathy, you want to make the closing argument?
Sure. I absolutely would reiterate everything that both Mark and Jennifer explained. Really look at what interest you're protecting. Is there room in that area to try to achieve the goal that the local government is trying to set? And even if there maybe is already some comprehensive, both state and federal regulation and enforcement in that area, there may still be opportunities to, we talked about this a little bit before, maybe acting as a conduit to those other resources to help empower your community. So, if someone knows that they can walk into an office and talk to someone in their local government who maybe has a broader access to other information or other resources, and really just serve as a great resource, a direct resource for the local communities.
Great. I appreciate that. So, as I indicated to this group beforehand, this notion of this discussion ending today it's not going to happen, or tomorrow, or 10 years, or probably 50 or 100 years. And if anyone wants to take that bet, I'll take it. This is going to be an ongoing discussion, and as issues arise, there's going to be questions about who is best suited to resolve those issues. And I really appreciate all of our panelists' time addressing my somewhat difficult questions, and addressing the is and the want and the should. If there are any other questions or concerns, we still have 5 more minutes. Okay, we've got some folks. Sir?
Thank you. I would bet first that those 2 movies you crashed were Ryan Gosling movies, weren't they? Ladies and gentlemen, the internet commerce has had a significant impact on our world and particularly on local governments. I mean, I'd like to hear y'all's thoughts on that, specifically like Mr. Symington, you passed, your communities passed a municipal sales tax, collecting on internet commerce, sales, and things like that. I'm from Pocahontas County. My county commission passed a very aggressive set of rules and regulations for hotel occupancy tax. And one of the things I built into that was the ability for the assessor, to get whatever software he needed. I'm not real good techie, but whatever software he needed to access the sites like Airbnb and all that, where people were dodging the HOT for the counties. And we've really expanded our collections in hotel occupancy tax by going that route. And there's got to be a lot of other things out there that you all have thought about and how internet commerce is affecting local government. I'd like to hear what you got to say about it.
Ryan, what do you got?
Sure. Well, luckily, we can rely on the state to collect that sales and use tax, and certainly municipal governments would struggle to make those contacts and those collections. But through the home rule program, all municipal sales taxes are administered by the state and then remitted. So it is a great example of cooperation, which there's been some discussion about and some discussion about in the last panel. I think those other uses that you talked about remain a challenge. Airbnb, you can't look at the specific location on the site without renting the property, right? So those are resource intensive to track those down. I mean, I would say the real internet sales problem that cities are dealing with is the availability of those services and the detriment to local business. That's something where we need to find other avenues to promote the local access that Loren has talked about.
Well, we've got 2 minutes left. Who's got a quick comment that they want to get in? Now, we want to get out on time, so you two, well.
I just wanted to ask if you're familiar with the $2 user fee that the city of Wheeling has enacted, and it's to help promote the public safety initiatives in the area. And so basically, I live in Ohio and I work in Wheeling, so I pay $2 a week as a tax or user fee. And if you're familiar with this, and it's to help promote public safety services to consumers, do you think it's a good idea? Do you have thoughts about it? And have any other cities enacted something similar in West Virginia?
Great, lots of tax questions. Many of the larger cities in West Virginia have these municipal service fees that are designed to fund police and street services, and they're based on people who the cities know travel into the city, which are sometimes non-residents, but it's a service fee just like, at least has the same authority as fire service fees and utility service fees that are where the cities reasonably classify the users, and for roads, those are people who drive on them, and then assess the fee against those users. And so we have Wheeling City Attorney here as well, but Morgantown has a fee, Parkersburg has a fee, Huntington and Charleston, so they're very common funding methods here.
Good. All right. We've got 1 minute. 1 minute.
Thank you. Colorado has used this home rule to publish a sex offender register that was then considered by the Supreme Court to be a stepping over the privacy of these sex offenders. I just wanted to ask you what's your take on that, and if it happens often that sometimes while protecting the privacy of customers, we overstep somebody else's privacy.
Wow. 1 minute for the answer. Who wants to address that one? Come on, Ryan.
Well,
you've done them all.
Under the bus.
That's why they pay you the big bucks.
That's interesting. We do public records management, of course, at the city, and in general, records of crimes are public records. I'm not, I don't have much facility with legally protecting privacy rights, and that's why I wasn't really reluctant on that point. I thought somebody else on the panel might have a better answer for you. I'm not familiar with the challenge. It's not a home rule initiative here. We operate under the under our Open Records Act that would, I assume, would require cities to disclose that type of information.
12 o'clock. I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you to everybody here. Great questions. And I'll turn it over to Gabrielle.
Thank you. Thank you again to our panelists and to Jonathan for moderating. At this time, we will be moving to the event hall for lunch and our keynote address. It is right around the corner. Follow the crowd or find a student. We can point you in the right direction. Thank you.
Well done, sir. Thank you. Pleasure.